this session is a really critical session. We're excited to begin the conversation here. It's a conversation that we're hoping to translate into action over the course of the next year. So my name is Amara Enya, and I chair the International Civil Society Working Group for the Permanent Forum. I also serve as policy director for Black Lives and as president of the transnational organization Global Black. And so with the Civil Society Working Group for the Permanent Forum has been working tirelessly, dare I say, to really make sure that the Permanent Forum as a mechanism reflects the will of those who have called and pushed for it to be established over many, many years. We understood, and those who have been in this work much longer than I have, understood the need to have a space, a mechanism that allows people of African descent from around the world to be able to come together collectively, not only to unpack and to address the challenges that we face as a collective, because we recognize that there are some similarities, but also to compare notes, to compare best practices, to find out where the landmines are, to develop strategies that actually take into account the nature of the issues that we face. And because we understand that we are facing global issues, we knew that we had to have an entity that allows us to develop global solutions and global action plans. And so that is what this mechanism represents as its potential. And it's that potential that we're leaning into because we know that there's a lot of work that is still left to be done. Our mandate as a working group was to ensure that the mechanism is fully resourced, adequately resourced, to allow it to carry out what we, civil society, particularly grassroots, community-based organizations, nonprofits, et cetera, are looking to do. We're not there yet. We have the Herculean task of navigating the UN bureaucracy and all that that entails. And we will try our best to be good navigators and to help our people understand the system so that we can maximize it as a tool for our purposes. That is what has inspired this event. I'm really excited because we have with us Professor Gay McDougall, who is one of the people, I was going to say uniform, who not only fully understands the UN system, but has worked inside the system extensively for a long time and has also been responsible for helping others, those of us who were newer in the space, to better understand and navigate the system. In addition to the PFAT as a mechanism, there are several other mechanisms that exist whose task is to address different issues related to people of African descent. There are many, and they all have a different kind of focus, a different niche, if you will. And so what we wanted to do today in this session is not only provide an overview of those other mechanisms, but to set us out on a path of what does it look like to begin to cohere these mechanisms in ways that connect our strategies so that we're not at odds, we're not competing for time and energy, that we are taking into consideration the various functions that each mechanism has. And out of this process, we want to engage civil society in an advocacy strategy to push for cohering the mechanisms, not necessarily merging the mechanisms or erasing the mechanisms, but cohering the mechanisms. It has huge implications for the work that we do. It has huge implications for how we approach not only these gatherings, these permanent forum sessions and MLAR sessions and other sessions, but how we actually structure our work in our own spheres so that we can move much more effectively as a collective on behalf of people of African descent. That is our goal. So out of this will come a work plan or a work, I like to say work, but I know some folks may, this is that or time away from that. But we are a work group, so that's what we do. But this is an action plan. It is a very tangible set of outcomes of which this conversation is laying the groundwork. And we're looking to implement it over the course of the next year. Why? because the next session isn't until next year. So we have plenty of time to begin to put our plan together and to mobilize civil society toward this agenda. So with that, I want to turn it over to Professor Gay McDougall, who'll provide an overview of the mechanisms and her expertise. And then we'll open it up for a little bit of dialogue, because we actually do want to hear from all of you and get your opinion. So this won't be a lecture, we'll actually be engaging. So if you feel comfortable, you can go a little, join.
It's over here.
Yes.
And
And
move over here, because otherwise.
yes. So while you're getting situated, I will introduce Kay McDougall, who will do this presentation, and then we'll go from there.
Okay, so first of all, I'm a more or less loyal member of the coalition myself. I start in and out, not always there, but I think it's a vital part of what the permanent forum can aspire to be. And it can aspire to be there only if the working is really dogged at getting it to be its best. Okay? And this is the only way the UN has been able to achieve much of what it's achieved over the many years that I've been associated with. The beginning of my involvement with the UN was about apartheid. And, that took years. And it only happened because the liberation movements were so skillful in manipulating the UN to get it to do exactly what they wanted it to do, to understand what its capabilities were at that time, and to get it to actually do what it needed to be done to leverage the power of the movement against apartheid. That is what inspired me to spend the rest of my life working as, and actually I've always been an outside lobbyist at the UN. I now sit on a committee that is made up of independent experts. So I'm not, one of the, I don't work for a government, never have, probably never would, but, I think increasingly it has become the case that civil society is recognized as a legitimate and necessary player at the UN and an engine for what the UN accomplishes. So we're going to talk today about the segment of the UN that is under the banner of human rights. And it has, are you with me?
Give me 1 second. Thank you.
Actually, we all sit in Geneva, not here, which is another problem. And I brought it up time and time again. I want to talk to the big boys, the guys with the, security guys. So there are two groupings. There are the special rapporteurs, and there are the treaty bodies. The treaty bodies, the oldest, etc. Okay, so I sit on the treaty body that was developed out of the International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. That's the first hit. It's called the Committee on Elimination of Racial Discrimination. The convention was the first achievement, really, against racism after the decolonization movement. The decolonization movement produced a collection of newly independent states, African states initially, and they came in with an agenda. Number one on the agenda was to codify the rules against racism for the world, not just for Africa, but so that led to this International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. It's the normative body. We deal with the laws. What we do is not so much make them as review every government's adherence to them on a one by one basis. There are now 181 countries that have ratified or signed the convention. That means we have reached the point of almost universal ratification. It means across every kind of legal system, every kind of religious system, every kind of culture around the world, everybody agrees that these are the laws. Now, that's an important point. And so countries come before us on a schedule where they, tell us how they have implemented the laws. And then importantly, their civil society people come and tell us the realities of the ground. So that's that when it, just do one at a time. I'll tell you when the next one. And so that has been going on since 1968. In the 90s, that's the next big step here. And I'm going to tell you some things about this convention. The next step is in the 1990s with the invention of the mandate of the Special Rapporteur against racism. Now, the difference here is that the Special Rapporteur gets to travel to countries. She, we just have a she, we have the second she, can go to whatever countries she so deems. She's on the ground, she talks to the government, she talks to the civil society, she learns what the laws are, what the practices are, gets to go to the communities. That's good stuff. There's later become, I was also served as the first special rapporteur on minorities, which was in the 2000s, I think, overlapping with racial discrimination, because most minorities are, racially or religiously, discriminated against. But so this was the system that existed for 20 years. So the UN didn't make another move until 2001. And the reason 2001 is that finally we got rid of apartheid. It used to be the major concern, the major thing on the UN agenda every year, General Assembly was apartheid. How to get rid of it, what we do. Then they get rid of it. What do they do? So, that's what the Durban Conference was about. And it was a highly contested conference. There's a lot of mythology about it now, both bad and good. I was there, I was part of the planning, I wrote the agenda. we thought it wasn't gonna happen. We thought it wasn't gonna happen well, because no government wanted to deal with the idea that racism was no longer a foreign policy matter, as it was with apartheid. You know, I mean, you know, what, every other government except for South Africa had to, you know, it was a foreign policy matter. Didn't have anything to do with their population. They thought maybe it did. But here, we had to get governments to understand that racism existed in every country in every region. That was a hard fought battle. But we got that. We also got a statement about reparations, very lukewarm statement about reparations, very lukewarm statement about crimes against humanity, and the legal or illegal nature of colonialism. But, you know, one of the things about the declaration, the Durban Declaration Program of Action, is that it really united a lot of different forces for change. The minorities, you know, constituency. We had 40,000 people there from all over the world. And it was mainly made up of groups who had been struggling with their own problems of invisibility because of their identity. And they were coming there in hopes that the Durban Declaration Program of Action was going to lift them up. And it did in many contexts. You had indigenous peoples there from all over the world. You had, you had Dalits from India. You know, you had people from everywhere. And it was a statement that fused all of those concerns into a broad non-discrimination agenda, along with the agenda of Palestine, which was very, very important, and which also was part of the seeds of the opposition to the declaration, which turned out to be two problems that we faced since then. One was the endorsement that the problems faced by Palestinians were human rights problems, racial discrimination problems. That, you know, the U.S. says it walked out because of that. But there was also the reparations question. I walked away thinking we did not get a good statement on reparations. The reality is that the European Union really said we're going to oppose you all the way down to death on reparations. And, you know, sort of blackmailed, if I can say, the Africa group, you know, sort of like if you want foreign assistance, foreign assistance reparations. But to this day, every time the word Durban is mentioned in a UN document, it is vehemently opposed. The whole document by the European Union and the US and Canada, the We Are group, vehemently opposed. And we almost didn't get the Perfect Forum thing because of that. So that's a reality for that. So, but Durban also gave us a new institution. It was the first time in all of that history, since the beginning of the UN to 2001, there was never any recognition of people who had been transported across, that were stolen and sent into slavery. Nothing about the transatlantic slave trade. So Durban lifted that up for the first time. And it created the working group of people of African descent, initially to focus on the transatlantic slave trade. And then it brought to consider more broadly people in the diaspora. It also gave us, so you can put that up, that's the next one. It also, and they also, like this special rapporteur, they're able to go country by country, be on the ground and interact with people, and they do reports on every country that they go to, etc. There is, and this is not up there, the Intergovernmental Working Group on people on the implementation of the Durban Declaration and Program. These are governments, and they are to see that the DDPA is kept alive and that it is implemented. There's also the group of eminent experts. Now, if you were in the last session on reparations, you saw Edna Rollins speak. She was the rapporteur of the Durban Conference and was a member of this eminent working group that was set up afterwards. That eminent working group was also almost killed by this blockage on anything that says Durban. The governments that boycotted Durban also held the purse strings backwards. So they almost killed the working group of people of African descent, almost killed the other group as well. So, okay, then we go another sort of couple of decades, and we get to George Floyd's murder. And George Floyd's murder in the 2020 uprisings forced a group of civil society actors, including me, to insist that we have a special mechanism that focuses on, let me say, what killed George Floyd. Now, what killed George Floyd was not simply a policeman. What killed George Floyd was the weight of history over the centuries that built up hatred against people of African descent. The history of the slave patrols and the sort of limited force of the slave patrols in terms of what they were able to do to the bodies of Black runaway slaves in the U.S. And so we wanted not just a mechanism that looked at policing out of control. We didn't want a whole lot of other additional recommendations on police reforms, body cams and training and stuff like that. It's already been proven that doesn't work. But we wanted to make a mechanism that will make that connection, a strong connection. And so we wanted them to focus on the countries where it was worse: U.S., Brazil, Colombia, France, the UK, and I'm sure there's some others we missed, but we started with those. So this was created in 1920, 21. Along with that, the High Commissioner wrote her report on racist policing in a number of countries, and she examined about 160 or 190 specific cases. I mean, delved into them. It was a good report. I was against it in the beginning, but it was a good report. And it came out in with her own program for moving beyond racism globally. Her 4-point transformative agenda for ending racial discrimination. And it was also good. I feel like I wrote it because I was notes. You know, you gotta get that commission, talk to the families, you know. And she gave us, in my view, this term reparatory justice, which is what people say when they don't want to say reparations. So that's a softer version that she thought that the government. So she is, I think we have one on that. Yeah. Now, within the office of the High Commission, the plan was that there was going to be a mechanism to follow up, or an office or a team or something, to follow up with governments on this 4-point agenda. Who's doing it, who's not doing it, whatever. And there will be a report out every year in September. Now, the report is happening. I don't know, I've not been able to identify a real team within the offices doing follow-up work. And what's it? Permanent forum on people of African descent. So this is what we call now the anti-racism architecture. There's one other thing that I will tell you. It's not up there, and that is that during the 2020 uprising, the Secretary General was forced to admit that there is racism within the UN. And so, of course, he set up a task force. You know, task force developed a strategic plan. And that strategic plan has a committee, an implementation committee that's overseeing with a view to increasing diversity, ending racism within the workplace, in the United Nations, etc. Anyway, so I didn't put that. We'll see. But there is a serious problem with the staffing. I mean, I just wrote a letter to the president of the Human Rights Council on the choice of the UN's the Special Rapporteur on Minorities was just chosen, and without transparency. And the top person, they put up 3 names, right? So the top person is Swiss. The second person is German. And, you know, it's sort of like, what are we doing here? Are you paying attention? You know, and when I say Swiss and German, I don't mean Afro-Swiss and Afro-German. These are 2 white men. You know, and it's just like now we've got a high commissioner, a new high commissioner, who also was appointed with absolutely no transparency at all. And I'm not judging him. I really don't know him yet. But, you know, it's not the era of appointing a white man to be High Commissioner for Human Rights. You know, I mean, if you don't get it, why that is not it, then, you know, I don't know. So here's our architecture. I'm going to tell you that until last November, when I called through my position at Fordham Law School, paid for somebody from all of these mechanisms to come together so that we could talk to each other. Otherwise, we never talked to each other, never met together, never strategized together, never had any discussions, but you do this, you do that. What's the best way to do, et cetera. I know that the members of the Permanent Forum don't have any idea about all of the stuff that's been produced by all of these decades of work, and they want to do it over again. So that's what we're here to talk about today. How important is it that there is coherence, cooperation, and coordination among the two, and that it is not just 7, you know, isolated, independent bodies, but really an ecosystem now working together, pulling all of these, you know, decades of knowledge that we have to see if we could use the UN as a platform for doing better and then racism.
I did say she's in a court. There are very few people who really understand, particularly the anti-racism architecture of the United Nations, but beyond just understanding it, have had direct contact with those different mechanisms. So this presentation is very, very important. Why? Because right now, as Gabe mentioned, the mechanisms don't really speak to each other. They're not really developing collective strategies. And so this begs the question of impact. Impact and time. And I mentioned time because there's an urgency, at least in my view, I sense an urgency about the need to move the needle on so many of the issues that folks are over in the plenaries talking about. But without the infrastructure to do that, we can have all the conversations we want on our different subject areas, and we will only be like walking through mud. We won't really be advancing.
Tracking the $8.
Exactly. So what we're looking to do, now that you've heard a little bit of the background, we wanted to pause and get some reflections from those of you who've been in the space. Take a few minutes to unpack some of what we've heard, and then we'll go into a discussion on how do we move the ball on this, because it's a huge task, but it's one that we have to be up for. Otherwise, what you'll find is those silos tend to perpetuate. And as Gay mentioned, we cannot assume benevolence because we're working within a system. We actually should err on the side of assuming we're always in hostile territory. And so how does that inform our thinking about what we can do to make sure that these different mechanisms are cohered, and how civil society can play a critical role in pushing this process forward, because it's not going to come from government, it's not going to come from the diplomatic corps that are pushing this agenda. It will have to come because civil society has mandated so. So with that, we'll have a stack, and folks can just respond with some reflections about questions also for Gay that you may have on the presentation, and we'll do that take the next 10 minutes or so for that. So I saw Robin and then Vince, and then your name? Adria? Okay, so Robin, then Vince, then Adria.
I have a couple questions, but I wanted to share also that I was the organizer for the CERD Task Force for U.S. Human Rights Network in 2012 when we submitted a UPR to Obama, but what is not known is that we also attempted to organize a working group to develop a national plan dealing with racism. And after UPR was submitted, the task force disintegrated. And we went on to submit a shadow report, DAIS, under Dr. Cornelia Randall, descendants of Africans enslaved in the US, not descendants of slaves, submitted a shadow report. But what I found in that process is, as you said, everything is siloed. And to update to right now, I've been investigating artificial intelligence, and I've asked questions about these various bodies. And I wonder why we couldn't develop a chat bot that will integrate all of these mechanisms, will pull all their data, all their reports, and bring them to a central location to be reviewed by everybody. Also, it would help navigate the UN in general, having a chat bot which would go and web crawl all of these existing online reports, mandates, policies, and their legal structures, so that we could have a one stop where we can make inquiry and get information on that. So that was one of the things that I've been working on the way of suggestions, because as we all know, the Chat GPT has a lot of ramifications in terms of accessing this artificial intelligence. Number one being the prompt engineering. It responds to questions that is given, but we're using a vernacular English that is not responsive to Ebonics, it's not responsive to the nuances of cultural differences. So you're not getting the outcomes from this artificial intelligence. So it's the input-output issue, and we're not drafting a input plan to leverage artificial intelligence. So those are two of the things I wanted to touch on.
I just want to respond to one little piece, because the rest of it I don't even understand. But there are databases on the UN's human rights output. So that you can, there's something called the Human Rights Index. And it, you know, you can say, what has everybody said on whether or not crossing the street is racially discriminatory. And you can see what every one of the, not just these, but all of the other bodies of the UN has said on that. Or you could say, what has CERT said on that? What is the UPR? So you now, and you know, the UN is now all the time being great on the website, you know, and all of that. But there are now databases, and there are databases on all of this that are university databases that are even broader, like the University of Minnesota. It's always had a really terrific one where you could find out all of that information.
Well,
but that, you know, what I hear is you're saying something beyond.
yeah, when you talk about statistics, the term is broken into the word. It comes from the word static. It's a report with data. It's a one-time report, may come out quarterly, may come out once a year. And what I'm pursuing is somewhat of a living algorithm of sorts of ongoing information being compiled by artificial intelligence, and compiling it so that there's accessibility on a hyper-local level basis to get information in your neighborhood and scale up with the data that's and also when you're talking about statistics, there's a formula that's there under CERD, and that is disparate impact, which is a measurable, and disproportionality is also a measurable, but we don't have those measures. We have statistics in a database.
I think that's a really good point. Our misgivings about AI aside and how we use that tool, but something that allows us to in real time collect data and store it and warehouse it in a way that takes advantage of the technology. But I'm also thinking, even just at the start, with the individuals on the different mechanisms, having a sort of curriculum, comprehensive curriculum that shares perhaps the latest reports that they are required to skim through as you step into the role. Like, what does an orientation for these independent experts look like, where they actually get, at least they don't have to go back 20 years or 30 years, even 15 years, but they at least have, perhaps it's the latest information or the latest data, the latest reports, and as required reading as a syllabus of sorts to sit in this space as an independent expert, right? So some kind of like an orientation.
Well, they are, there's an orientation curriculum for both funds, special rapporteurs and treaty bodies. But it's largely on the processes, not on the, as I say, the output of the system. So maybe if we could.
Vince, and then Adria, Eric, Ade, Monte.
And so my first exposure to the UN, beyond hearing it on the news, was in Geneva in December. What happens behind the scenes, what got me there were people in this room. What happens in the UN to facilitate for us or to maintain records or to do anything with what we did, I don't know. What my sense is from you guys that you've been immersed in some portion of all of these and at their inception, and for those to the extent they still operate. For each one of these boxes, I'm assuming you went through chronologically, what has happened to the people and the structure? I've heard a lot about Durban, so it seems like that was one of the most apt, people were most passionate about it, most put into it, touching everything we are still touching today. So we focus on that. But all these other boxes, all these other programs, these other groups, for lack of a better way of expressing it, that were put together. In shorthand, can we talk about where they are like right now? And do we still have these 7 on some level? And if so, what would be the challenge with doing what I thought I heard Mara say, doing some synthesizing?
Okay, so that's actually what we're here to talk. I'll tell you that there are 2 things that I would say. Some of these bodies, these are active bodies now. Nothing has gone away. That's it. Each one of them can do some things, can't do the other. None of them can do everything. And so there are some pieces of knowledge that some have enough, that none that has the universe of experiences. And, I mean, I learned, because I was a special rapporteur, as well as I'm a treaty body. And I'm now on the treaty body, because I can't do that much traveling. But my colleagues on the treaty bodies have no idea what it's like to go to a community of people who have been subjected to the worst treatment, who, are off in some distant part of their country because they've been pushed out there. And you go out there and you sit down in a dusty, circle with them and hear what that doesn't get to Geneva. What gets to Geneva, I mean, if we do it, there are lots of civil society people come. They're people who either have or can get the money to come, who have the wherewithal in one way or the other to engage with us. And so these are people who are speaking for those other folks. But it makes a difference in what you say in the outcome when you have done that. So it's an experience that it turns into information that only part of these have. The other thing is that none of these can do anything but make recommendations. No, we don't make anything happen. The most we can do is use our bully pulpit to strengthen the role that internal civil society people are trying to play in the country. And so they come away from us with a piece of paper that we wrote, where we say on it what is going to enable them and empower them to go the next step. That's so we can't, we're not governments. We make these recommendations to government. And that's one thing to keep in mind at the permanent forum when we're making recommendations there. I mean, there's some recommendations that have come up like, let's have the UN Human Rights Council put up a commission on reparations. Last thing I would do. Believe me, they are going to mix the whole thing. So, you have to know what's capable out of each group and what's likely out of each group. But, the special rapporteur on racism only goes 2 countries a year. And third, we're looking at 10 countries a year. And interacting with the civil society people in 10 countries a year. So there are lots of different,
So that's being driven by UN staff, that the groups that like us maybe never meet or met at the last conference, but don't have a constant dialogue or interaction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's another. You mentioned another group that I did put on here that has a lot of power. That's the UN Secretary. And they are their own center of influence. And they have their own interests that sometimes try to drive us to serve their interests. So.
We'll go to.
Yeah, go ahead, sorry. I'm usurping your role.
No. So you don't have to worry about keeping track of the James. Adrian, Eric, Ade, Montega.
Well, first, let me just say, like, they're not big. And my first time was in you arguing. And I say that because it's helpful to have a context for the framework. I think that's right, like that's what understanding all of this, have a special plan about how they think, which makes a huge difference in life. This is why this happened, so it would be so helpful, like I don't know credit this, but to have that lead into any curriculum orientation would be amazing. Because this has helped me far more than anything else understand, like why I'm here and why we're all here. So I thank you for that. And if I can just build on what was already shared, I love the AI idea because the power of AI is to pull not just information, but to actually pull it inside of a prompt that might say, what would be the best course of action next, based on all this information that you have? Pull it out and say, do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? And that to me is an amazing action that could be so powerful for people around the world to be able to tap into the power of that, so that it becomes actionable, that it work
Absolutely. I appreciate that as well, because when people are coming to the permanent forum session, I think it is important to be grounded in the why, right? So are we here just to have dialogues and share the individual work that we're working on? What is the infrastructural backdrop to this gathering? Why is it important? And frankly, if we don't address the infrastructural backdrop, then it simply becomes another space for people to pay money to come and share their work, their individual work, but it doesn't actually move our collective agenda forward. And so it was one of the reasons behind putting this session together, because we do want to do that kind of grounding. I do think it's a good idea going forward to have sort of a 101 type of orientation or video recording session at every convening, every session of the permanent forum, but even something that's portable that we could actually just share with folks broadly, where they can maybe watch a 10-minute video on Web 101 before they get there. That's something we can email out to our listeners, to our database. So those are really good, actionable ideas that are just coming out of this space. So really appreciate that. We'll go to Eric, then Ade, and then
Yeah, I think I'm echoing what some of my colleagues are saying. First, thank you for this space, and you're being strategic about it and figuring out how, I think as you said in the plenary session today, how we're actually going to get to the implementation phase with states. Because I've now been a part of going to CERD last year, done contributions to the special rapporteur, EMLR, and now here, and we've gotten great concluding observations, like you've said. But I'm looking at these and I'm like, okay, now what? Now what am I going to do with these, especially to make the United States of America treat Haitians better? How am I going to do that? And so what I see is like, and what I see coming together is, you know, you made the comment about how a lot of the great steps and these happened after popular movements, after uprisings to some degree. And so the question for me is, how do you use interfacing with these mechanisms in a way that helps the popular movements and is also transnational, so that we can attack this global power structure that is racist? So my question, and the thing that it really bothers me, is how do we get around like the structure of the United Nations, the UN Security Council having 3 of the 5 permanent veto votes from the US, France, and whoever, you know, colonizers, enslavers. The other 2 are colonizers in other areas of the world. And they act like they're competing, but it seems like they're all coordinating to just keep their power, keep their spheres of influence. And so how do we use all this to get a transnational global uprising that can somehow deconstruct this power when they have all the bombs and the veto votes? How do we do that? These are the thoughts.
Well, I think that you know, it really matters who's at the table. Now, I'm going to give you an example that is not, you know, we've been fighting this thing about how the U.S. every resolution through the Human Rights Council that mentions Durban or whatever, or reparations, is hacked by the U.S. Durban's a nasty word, that it was racist, and it was like whatever. But so here we're going to the permanent forum. And believe me, I have argued myself to death during the Obama administration. I argued with everybody in the line of decision making in the Obama administration. I mean, you know, even in the Biden administration, you know, in fact, I couldn't even get anybody to tell me who it is that makes this decision. You know, I mean, nobody, most of the people weren't even born when we went to Durban. You know, I mean, who is making this decision? So, okay, we get to the closing session, where everybody thinks that it's just ceremonial. There's going to be a stamp of approval on permanent forum, right? So I'm looking at the thing on TV and I'm saying, wow, look at what the US person is saying. Look at what I think it was the UK person, they were bothering about something that didn't quite seem to fit with the substantive matters. What's going on here? And this was a time when it was the last session on the calendar for the permanent forum to be decided on, right? So if it didn't go through then, it was going to be a couple of months or something into the future. You shaking your head there. So, I was saying, what does that mean? And then it, in fact, does end with these, questions of air or whatever. And, so I called up somebody in the gym and they said, well, we figured that this is all about the fact that the permanent forum was under the agenda item of implementation of DERB. Not that anything was discussed in the whole discussion about the thing, but that it was under that agenda item that the UN, that the US and the UK, on behalf of the European Union and we are we're going to block it. And let me say 2 or 3 people called up Linda, the US ambassador, said, listen, you say you're a sister. This is the time to prove it. And now, to her credit, Monday morning, she arranged to reopen that session and she came to it and said, whatever the concerns are about what happened in 2001, the permanent forum is bigger than that. And that's how we did it. So, one point is a dramatic series at the table. Now, getting people at those tables is a long process, pipeline, whatever. But it matters. And so that's one thing to constantly think about. And then holding those people accountable. If she hadn't been called, first of all, I don't think that she was really even watching what was going on. I'm not even sure that she was in a line of decision making about it. I mean, these are long-standing orders of procedure. Nobody knows why. They have, in the State Department, they have to cross out Durban. They just told that, like good soldiers, they do it. So, the people have to be there and you have to hold them accountable. So she was called on a Sunday at her home, and she did the right thing. That doesn't always work, but you got to try. That's one thing. I don't think you ought to put a lot of your energies into trying to get the Security Council changed. There are lots of governments on the Security Council, that rotate on and on. But the veto is a real stick in the, a mud in terms of the UN's ability to be effective on a long list of things. And until the world is truly ready for a different world order, we're not going to be able to get rid of that. So what else is it? These things. Now we've not reached our effort in terms of this. There's some simple things that we could do to kind of squeeze out more effectiveness, I believe, that haven't been tried. We could talk to each other. We don't. And the thing is, right now, we are facing some serious pushback. I mean, some serious pushback. The special rapporteur on racism, nice woman, I don't want to say it that bad. She's a nice woman, you know, and I think she's very competent. But the point is, it was some shenanigans that happened in order to move out the obvious, clear next person in that position. Because it was clear that this is going to be somebody who was going to follow in the tradition that had been laid by today. And as they said when they appointed the new one, she's going to broaden the definition and approach to it. I just written a letter about the minorities person. So, I mean, there's some, so we need to talk. Not everybody's watching that. And, you know, so that, you know, that's another thing to talk about.
And a couple of just another point on what was happening at the time the resolution was passed. So those of us who were in civil society who had been doing the meetings with the ambassadors and all the lobbying and all of that had gotten notice or had gotten word of what was going on, and we were required to mobilize very, very quickly to draft op-eds, to make phone calls, to put together graphics for social media. We actually had to be ready to have a full-on, I don't want to say a
campaign.
full press. Oh, campaign. A full court press to support those who were inside making the phone calls. Meaning we had to also show that we were visibly dissatisfied with what was going on. And so I'm coming back to that because it's important to emphasize the role that civil society plays in applying pressure, so that when those who are inside of these structures can make the phone calls, maybe they go on Twitter or something and see some hashtags, and that might be the thing that sends them over the edge in terms of, okay, I do need to say something. So our engagement is critical to the legitimacy and the function of these mechanisms and to pushing our agenda, which is internal as much as it's external. It's those internal decisions, the lack of transparency, the strategy behind selecting certain persons versus other persons that we have to be paying attention to, as well as our responsibility to mobilize our people so that when we need to be heard, we can be heard. And something that I think is important at this time is that the legitimacy of the UN as an entity is something that I think civil society should be leaning on. If you don't have civil society to come to the permanent forum, then what's the value? Government's talking to themselves, they can do that any other time, right? So this is a time going into this next year where we can really play up the importance of civil society as an imperative for the legitimacy of the UN as a whole, but also of these mechanisms that have been created to serve our interests. Ade, and then Montega, and then what's your name? Stella and Taylor. Ade, Montega, Stella.
I'm gonna begin by calling Professor Google on, you know, the resilience in being part of the development of these mechanisms, which give us some sort of structure to work with. Because I think by the time I met you, which was in 2015, 2016, we only had the top four. Now we have 3 new mechanisms, and as you said, they all, you know, have different, though similar work that we can all engage in to ensure that Afrophobia is eliminated. And so I have to begin by calling you as of this work on this. Then secondly, I'm going to go on to make 2 recommendations based, you know, it's comparing a lot what I've heard in the room. I'm just saying education, we do need civil society and grassroots organizations and individuals to be aware that these mechanisms exist and they may not be able to solve the problem, but they can be deterrent. And with greater collaboration, which is the second thing I was coming to, greater collaboration between the mechanisms and also working with civil society, which is in line with the Vienna Declaration, and the 2030 agenda, which was participation in policy. So collaboration in that respect, because it's absolutely, especially when two things came to mind when you were speaking as well. The TTA, sorry, the 4-point transformative agenda. I value for that. I think it's very good and it's something that we should be working with. I'm happy to hear that there's a report that's been done annually. I think there should be some smart transparency that civil society not only knows that there is such a report, but has access to it and can contribute to it. Also, the draft declaration, I'm sure you agree, is something that there needs to be greater collaboration between not only mechanisms, but also with civil society to ensure, because that, as you rightly said, those of us who come to Geneva, we try to represent the interests, but we can't represent everyone. And there are some very serious human rights violations.
I'm very concerned about the declaration. The Declaration on People with so I'm concerned about, the lack of involvement in the actual process. I mean, from the beginning, I kept saying to people, way back 2-3 years ago when the preps started, and y'all know you're not writing the declaration. That's writing the declaration. And at this point, have almost finished writing it. And so what are we talking about?
Well, we've got in the international coalition, we have a small, about 5 of us are looking at editing emissions. But that, as I said, 5 people in one organization can't represent transport. So I think there needs to be, which is why I say education, there needs to be greater awareness that this declaration is on price. There needs to be greater involvement from civil society.
Well, that's what I think you all have to do. You need to be circulating the
You have a question online, so just put them in the queue, please. Thank you.
You need to be circulating the drafts. Now, I did a 0 draft the last time, but I presented it in the session, and the government subjected.
That's what I'm working with. They don't have.
You're working with the one that I did?
I suspect that is the one that we were working with the 0 draft.
So, well,
Not as a government,
yeah, because basically they said because they were already negotiating and had gone almost half through at that point. So what was it that I was, So I said, but I think that there needs to be a decision made by at the permanent forum levels, because they're just letting this float in the air. Is if somebody needs to say what is the process and how does civil society really look. Now they did ask various members of these bodies to come and give our views. And Pastor Murillo has been involved giving his views. But there's been no broad, social movement involvement.
Yes, there should be.
So I think that's something that we can pose before this session is up. Pose to the members of the PFAT as one of the strong recommendations that have to come out of this session.
I mean, what they will say is, well, if you want to stop this process now, there won't be a declaration agreed to by the end of this decade. Now, personally, I would say, okay, let's have another decade. You gotta do this right. This is gonna be the document for all time. You don't get a second go round.
And they've been delaying it. It's at least 2019 at the very latest, they've been delaying it. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely think it's a strong recommendation that we should make in this, before this session, during this session. So we have Montega, Stella, Kayla, and then we have about 15 minutes and we're wrapping. So Dr. Angelique, and then what's your name?
Alan Chipman.
And then your name?
Montega.
Montega. Montega. Are you sure? Okay. Stella.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Just wanted to say a real thank you as well to Gabe for taking us through all of this. I think this is really, really helpful. And also, for me, I work specifically in migrations of diaspora development and migration. And of course, with the Global Compact on Safe Body and Regular Migration, that was started in 2018, we then had sort of some acknowledgement, like first time, of the link between migration and racism, white race. And then following on from there, last year, first International Migration Forum of the Global Compact, the Progress Declaration, and goes through a number of different drafting stages, and civil society were really involved in that process. So one of the things that we tried to do and did do was to get an acknowledgement of systemic racism within the Progress Declaration. But it took, exactly like you were saying, in terms of civil society pressure, it took a number of drafts for us to get that in. But there was a longer version of it, which was about linking systemic racism to historical legacies of slavery and colonialism. And now I understand, just listening to you talking about the Durban Declaration and the challenge with the underlying sort of like messaging and all of that. I can now understand much better as to why, even though we put that in so many times, it made so many different arguments, that wasn't picked up, obviously. But then what I also wanted to ask was that as part of the implementation of the GCM, which sits under the UN network of migration, there are a number of different work streams, and one of them is the work stream on anti-discrimination, which has a focus on racism. And it's co-chaired by the UNC and supported so as a stakeholder. But of course, we also know that there isn't very much support for that specific work stream, and that's so I guess the question is, and yes, there's a lot of interest from the civil society side. So I guess my question is, how do we push more for? Because of course, I understand in terms of the member states who basically hold the purse strings, etc. But I know for a fact that when that progress declaration was concluded here at the UN last May, a number of member states stood up and spoke really strongly about the racism part of it. They were all on board. Of course, not the ones that we would have liked to stand up, not the ones in purse strings, but there were a number of others who really stood up and spoke about it. But then beyond that, you don't really get a sense of this sort of like movement on their side. And I guess with your understanding of how things work on the inside, are there other ways in which we can get those without the purse strings perhaps to push a little bit more?
Well, first of all, this is another side of the migration. I don't know how you get those to push more because, I was reading the Global Compact Agreement. And just the other day, and I was saying, how many more UN documents are we going to get this all say the right thing and in such detail, and nobody is doing it. And not a single, well, I shouldn't say a single, but the problems are of those governments that really don't want, well, they don't want migrants of color. They don't want migrants of color. And if we have to find a way to confront that. They don't say all the right things. But they don't actually want migrants of color. And they wouldn't be able to distinguish one with a PhD from one, that didn't graduate from, elementary school. That, it's the Black person, the person of color, whatever. So again, I think that, and as I read it, I said, now really, here's another silo that should be meeting. This is a major, important area of concern for people of color now. And, we ought to be meeting together at least once a year. And again, to me, it is a little bit, I would love to have the money to be able to invite all of these silos once a year. Let's all get together and talk about what needs to be done. And it would need to be without our hands, because as I said, they're all separate interests. But, we need to meet with the migration people. I don't have, out of all this time I spent in it, I don't have an idea of actually the mechanisms in the migration area. I know IOM and I know the UNHCR, but not the internal, workings.
Something that could potentially be next step within the migration space is actually the same way that we outlined the mechanisms under the anti-racism architecture is going into some of these more sector-specific areas and doing the same. Because then we can then plug them into the relevant mechanisms here while we're also cohering these mechanisms, because you're not going to have a situation where migration doesn't deal with racism, right? That's the basis for a lot of that. So that might be a next step that I would invite folks to do if you are in some of those other spaces, to begin to initiate the process. And perhaps that's something that the working group can support, because we do have folks who are in some of these other sector specific areas that are dealing with some of the same siloing that we're talking about as a whole.
We also meet online research to begin with, since we haven't got the funding to have a virtual.
Absolutely. So that, it would make sense to just do it virtually. It might be, hey, let's meet. I know this person here, that person there, let's meet. And so we can create the container to do that. And we can do that virtually. So
there is I don't know if it's innocent, there is a network on minorities throughout the secretary. Geneva includes here as well as in the field. These are people in the secretariat, spaces that meet. I cannot say how effective they are, et cetera, but they are a network, which means that you can tap into what's going on, what they're thinking, et cetera. And so good.
Absolutely. Dr. Angelique Allen? Yeah. Linnea.
Thank you, Dr. Amara and Dr. Gay, who we applaud greatly. Thank you so much. So my question had to do with what we're actually talking about here. To what extent, quite bluntly, have they ghettoized her? around the larger agenda of the UN. Because it seems to me the whole point of the UN is to really put the fire under the member states. I mean, what I get concerned about is scurrying around with all these different places when the real objective is to say to the member states where we go home, thus say whatever. And I just don't want us to lose the prize, right? The eyes on the prize. The prize is we want our member states to do what's right. And it's racism, it's migration, it's an integrated platform. So it seems to me there are two tracks. One is the mobilization on the ground. Us, when we go home and we talk to our mothers and our fathers and our sisters and all the rest. And it's also at the, if you will, the structural level, okay? I'm more concerned about that, quite frankly, in terms of what the real eyes on the prize needs to be. Is moving these member states off the dime to get it done. So how do we do that? I think it's easy to be distracted by growth, quite frankly. I mean, that's just me. I work at the World Council. I mean, I'm just saying, I love, look, Donnie here, they all know, I love the World Council. But I also understand bureaucracy. I get it. So I don't want us to get lost in the shuffle. And we're going here and there, and we're not going right to the presidents of our United States and all the other places. They're here, they spoke, the ambassador was here herself, right? I would have those conversations.
Well, but I think this is absolutely the right point, which I tried to raise this morning in the plenary. If we don't have implementation, you know, I mean, it's the governments, the states, they have to. So, I mean, getting back to, I think, what do we do when we issue our paper, whatever, like you're supposed to take it home. That's and hold.
Hello?
We don't know how to be powerful. We don't know how to call up powerful people and tell them what we think they should do. You know, it's a part of feeling marginalized. And I know that there is a very small, tiny minority in this country that makes everything they care about happen. In Washington, indeed in the UN, because through Washington, they get the UN. So, you know, we have to, and this is another agenda for all civil society organizations, because we don't practice it there. We practice how we get this. That's important. But we have to learn how to be powerful at home. Or nothing really happens. You know, and when we come together like this, we also have to talk about every single time, how do we make it happen? You know, how are we powerful? How do we leverage our power? If I can't call a person, who do I know that can call the person and tell them that I'm mad or somebody's mad and that they ought to do it differently? Because we, you know, that's the point here. That's what happens.
And to your point, Dr. Angelique, part of the discussion before you got here
I'm so
was,
sorry, I know you're stuck.
well, I'm not saying we solved everything. Touch on it. But it was, I mean, it's the impetus for this session, right? So we outlined 7 different mechanisms. We were in Geneva just a few weeks ago for another mechanism that are all designed to serve, or ideally supposed to serve people of African descent, but they're operating in silos. They don't communicate with each other. The level of orientating to previous reports is not there. So we actually discussed some specific actions that can break down those silos, begin to bring them together so that we can develop a coherent agenda. Because if we're not organized, we're not calling the right people, right? So to get to where you can actually, and we went over the process when getting the PFAD established, where Gay outlined who filed who that called the ambassadors to the UN. Meanwhile, civil society, we were mobilizing, putting out op-eds, graphics, this and that, to make it happen. But if we're not organized, then we're not going to be in any of the corridors of power. We'll be talking to each other and holding conferences, but we won't actually be utilizing our power. Hence why sessions like this are critical, because it deals with the infrastructure for getting into the corridors of power to make transformative changes that suit our agenda. And it supersedes all of the subject matter work, which we know is going to continue happening. But if we have a platform or platforms and mechanisms, we need to maximize them to the extent we possibly can.
One quick follow-up on that, and that is, I wonder to what extent can we get the writings on the shelf or the digital space to local communities? So once we have that kind of coordination, maybe it's gonna have resources to help us. We do other organizations.
So we touched on that a little bit earlier on the AI technology, the potential mechanism. There are databases that currently exist to which we do that. The need for mass engagement, education campaign around some of the reports and the findings of the reports, even to the extent of a 101 type of orientation at the UN. So all of those are captured. So we'll be putting that out in the postscript for this event with the recommendations that we're putting to civil society for how we move this forward. Thank you. Alan?
Yeah.
And then Linnea.
Very, very similar question. As far as the relationship between civil society and the UN mechanisms, how can, of course, civil society help legitimize the UN mechanisms, but also vice versa, how can the UN mechanisms help to legitimize civil society and organizers who are going against local bodies, state bodies that are a little bit more malleable than some of the heavily concretized powers that just walk away from the table? How can we get some of the, as brother it said, some of the findings out, especially with MLAR. I was just in Atlanta for a Human Rights Cities Alliance conference around housing and police brutality. But we're really trying to mobilize around how do we educate communities who are easily facing violations, especially around housing and police brutality, to use and weaponize these against local bodies that are more open to an op-ed or an attack ad. How do we get that information out and also be able to maybe give more of a specified report to some of the special rapporteurs who are very limited in how many countries they can visit?
I will say, and then we'll go to our last comment, so that we're at time. There's a level of, I think, again, organizing on our side, right? So we have to be organized, but we have to collaborate a lot more. So there isn't any reason why 20 organizations that were at the Human Rights Cities Summit last week couldn't say collectively, let's all get behind doing a 12-month public education campaign, political education campaign on housing or on what specific. So it's not all, yes, this is our collective task, but it's also amongst us collaborating more amongst ourselves to develop the kind of curriculum that's portable, that can be used across the board, so that we're all working from at least the same kinds of frameworks. And the powers that be are hearing it over and over again, right? Because that's what puts the pressure on. That's what gets them to, if they only hear it one time every 5 years, well, that's not, but if they're hearing it from 20 different places and everyone is sounding similar, right, and then we're coming together in these collective spaces, it shows that there's something, it's not something that can be easily dismissed. So I'll share that, and I think we can talk even after this.
Sure.
A little bit more when we have time and release the room. Very quickly.
Yeah, because Professor Hansford talked about, because there's a lot of this around policy, so and law. So I think this is something that group that he's proposing is set up, but also engage in work on.
We have all the specific aspects.
And listen.
Thank you. Linnea.
Hi, Linnea City Episcopal Church. I'm here with my colleague, Pam Ronberg, who's our missioner for people of African descent. And I just wanted to offer some concrete thoughts and suggestions. I spend a lot of time along with our colleagues going to various UN meetings. So we're always, as a civil society representative, thinking strategically of how can we influence the decision makers within the UN. And one of the things that I've seen operate very effectively from the civil society viewpoint, regardless of whether it's the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, UN Climate Change Conferences, the high-level political forum on the SDGs, no matter what, is that when there is a caucus representing civil society, and many times it might be a youth caucus, a women's caucus, there might be, some distinctions across regions or ages or whatever, but a caucus that can gather NGOs together of various types, that gets together, perhaps you have this already on this statement, so forgive me if you do, but they often meet the weekend ahead of the actual UN meeting to figure out together as thought leaders of civil society, what are the one or two points that we want to raise in terms of agreed language that we want to see become part of the agenda. So it's not necessarily that it's going to be decided, but just like today, all the calls for a second decade, for example, is something that has been floated as an idea by some participants. And we've just seen the power of that for civil society, as well as thinking specifically of permanent forum on Indigenous issues, the importance of an NGO working group to do that work year round and work with the UN system, as well as somebody in the secretariat for the permanent forum who can actually respond to civil society requests. And then another suggestion for the UN side that we see as state bodies is the existence of interagency task forces to gather UN agencies that are working on similar themes to talk to each other. I don't know as much about how that works because obviously we're on the civil society side, but we have seen where various UN agencies have to meet internally, almost like a council of agencies on a regular rotation in order to stay forward. So I just wanted to lift those up from our experiences in case they're helpful. Thank you.
That's extremely helpful. Thank you so much for that offering. And just to kind of close, I do want to reiterate that the working group in our pre-PFAB prep session developed specific talking points that we put together and shared with everyone, outlining some of what we want for the Secretariat in terms of support, resources, budget, staffing, etc. We also had a set of talking points around the Durban Declaration. Those talking points are designed to be implemented or incorporated into your verbal and written submissions. Because when it's said over and over again, it shows the level of buy-in that this is the agenda. These are the things that we are specifically demanding as a collective. So I'm saying that to reinforce that we're not just putting those things together to send you an email. There's a specific strategy behind this working group of what we're asking people to do. And so when we get talking points, when we talk about them in our prep sessions, that's the purpose, because we know that when you get into these spaces where we have to make demands, they have to hear repetitively, they have to hear something similar so that it sounds like there is a block of folks who are calling for this. And if they don't respond to that call, there will be consequences, right? So just reiterating that to affirm the role that the working group plays and can play going forward, needs to play going forward. Some of the next steps for this, because we do not have a session for the next year, give or take a few months, our task is to mobilize around this agenda to push for the cohering of these mechanisms. That is the task that we have at hand. Some of the concrete ideas that came out of this session would be incorporated into that strategy. As a working group, when we do our meetings, we'll be discussing that strategy, as well as that secondary issue of the Durban Declaration Program of Action, because it's time to turn the corner on the resistance to DDPA before the decade ends. We cannot let the decade end with that facade still up. And it is up to civil society to be the ones to push aggressively for that agenda. And we have to be on one accord. So that, because we won't be in the throes of planning events like we've had to do from December to May, we can now take up this work as our work and our mandate going forward. And we'll incorporate what we've got in here and in our subsequent meetings so that we're building toward a robust campaign that speaks to the purposes of this event. I want to thank and invite you all to thank Professor Gay McDougall. The master class that we all received for free, except what you paid to get to Jamaica. But I mean, it's top-notch content, and yeah, you are an absolute gem, a gem. And so I'm hoping that we can train up a whole army of Gay McDougalls who are willing to get into the trenches and fight the good fight. Take it to the street, yeah. Absolutely. Find systematic ways to do it. Yes, indeed. So on that note, thank you all. We will see you at the session bright early tomorrow morning. Hopefully you're not having issues with passes and things, but if you are, see me afterwards. Make sure you